Okay, we are back on another episode of the Shared Practices podcast. Welcome, George. How are you doing today?
Doing good. I'm excited to have my classmate on the line today, and I think everyone's going to really enjoy this interview.
Yeah, this is really cool. Ike Urling reached out to me while I was in the middle of treatment planning for implant boards. It was like 12 midnight my time, almost 1 a.m. And I was just excited to talk to another human being because I'd been waxing up and doing presentations for hours and hours and hours. And he was asking me about this off-market approach of sending out mailers and getting direct responses. And so I was like, man, this would be a great episode down the line. And then to have you go out and actually interview him and have the results of his effort is a really cool thing for me. So how you met Ike, is he in your class or is he a class above or below you?
No, he is in my class. We actually interviewed together. He is one of two other people I interviewed with that are now my classmates.
No
so
way.
we've
Okay.
known each other but we were not actually we did never really interacted before we started talking about your podcast before I was a co-host.
Huh. Okay. So our class size at Midwestern was big enough. Are you in one of the classes of like 140, I guess?
Yeah, 140.
140. So, you have your groups of people you hang out with, but so you and Ike knew of each other and had met each other and kind of hung out, not off campus or whatever, but hadn't really talked much. And then the podcast somehow brought you two together.
Yeah, and he was telling me that it was the Scott Luna interview that you did,
Okay.
where he talks about he was concerned about his student debt, and Scott told him to get into, or Scott told everybody to get into ownership as fast as possible, and that's what kind of maybe lit the fire to get him to do all of this that he talks about in the episode.
I think the direct quote from Dr. Luna was the easiest way to get rid of a lot of student debt is to make a lot of money. And then he details how practice ownership is going to do that for you. So I definitely was glad to get him on and that inspired other people as well. So, so now Ike has the benefit of, he had heard of both of these methods, your method and this other method of finding practices off market. And today he kind of merges it all into this genius plan of finding practices. So I'm really excited to hear his perspective.
Yeah, and I think what he really brings to the table is his experience, sheds light on sellers, their mindset, and their priorities.
Yeah. And I love some of the stories he's going to tell about sitting down and actually talking with the seller. And sellers are different, and sellers have their own priorities, and you got to make sure that those align with what you want and where you're going to go with this practice. So, was there anything else you want to talk about before we dive into the interview?
I think I'm good.
Okay, here we go.
I'm excited. I have with me today a classmate of mine, Ike Urling. So Ike is a longtime listener of the Shared Practices podcast. We actually weren't really that good of friends throughout dental school up until this point, but we actually got introduced from this podcast before I became a co-host. And Ike is actually somebody that we can thank for last week's interview with Dr. Jordan Thomas, where we talked about finding off-market deals. Jordan and Ike kind of worked together, and Ike followed Jordan's technique. So this is almost going to be a continuation of that episode. So before I go in anymore, how's it going, Ike?
Good, George. How you doing?
So how's it feel to be on the podcast you listen on?
It's very weird. It's very weird.
Well, let's just go ahead and dive right in. Let me give you a little background. So Ike came up to me a little bit before I started the co-host of the podcast, and at this point, I had already found the practice I was going to buy, and everything was already done that you guys listened to in season 2, episode 9. That was already done, and Ike, independent of me, before we had ever talked, was using my spreadsheet that he downloaded on the resource page, and he was actually going through looking at practices that he found using Jordan's technique, which we talked about last week. And so it was kind of funny because, we both were looking at practices that were in the same $1 to $1.5 million range. We were both doing it using my spreadsheet and my techniques, but we found them completely different ways. And then the thing that I really want to talk about today is the relationship that Ike has with his seller and the relationship I have with my seller that I think makes these deals possible. So, Ike, why don't you just go ahead and tell the audience a little bit about your background?
All right, perfect. So I'm from Arizona. I'm actually from a little tiny town, northeast Arizona called Snowflake. I came down to the Valley, went to undergrad here at ASU, got married to my wife down here. We've been together for almost 7 years. And I have an older brother that's actually a dentist, but my wife was working as a dental assistant. She's kind of the one that got me kind of interested in dentistry. One of my brothers were entrepreneurs, and I knew I wanted to do something with business, and kind of turned out that dentistry was the route that I went. So anyway, so I kind of went into dental school kind of wanting and expecting to be an owner at some point. I didn't have that timetable nailed down until actually, it was about midway through my third year. I have a little commute to school, and I started listening to podcasts. And one of the first podcasts I stumbled across was Dr. Mark Costas' podcast, Dentalpreneur. And I happened to listen to the episode where he interviewed some students from North Carolina, and Jordan Thomas was on the interview. And Jordan Thomas talked about how he went through and found these practices. And I just kind of fell in love with the idea. And I think this was January of my third year. So this was about 7 months ago. So I was able to contact Jordan through Facebook, actually. And he was very gracious and very, very nice, and he was able to share his ideas and his blueprint with me. And so I thought it was such a great idea. And he kind of talked about how, and I had reached out to some of the local brokers too, and they didn't give me a whole lot of attention, where I was at in my career and as a new grad and things like that. And so I really pursued this route. And plus I really wanted to knock out the broker fee. So Jordan was really nice, and I went on to vistaprint.com. My wife had a coupon, so I went on to vistaprint.com, and I made essentially the same mailer that Jordan did. And I got a list of the local dentists, of all the dentists in Arizona. And then I went through and I picked the zip code. So I'll backtrack for a second. So one of the reasons I actually wanted to do this mailer was I'd always kind of heard that, rural was better. And they tell you, get out of school, go someplace, and you can make a lot of money rural, and then you can live where you want. And my brother actually lives in a small town in Missouri, and he does really well. And I talked to him about this, and that was kind of his experience. But he liked the small town life. And even though I'm from a small town, I didn't want to go back. And my wife has family here, and it was really important to me that I lived where I wanted to live. And a lot of people were a little bit pessimistic about, I say a lot of people, a few people were pessimistic about my idea of wanting to stay here in the Valley, but so I said, okay, well, I'm just going to kind of knock on that door and see if it opens. So fast forward to after I listened to Jordan's podcast, and I picked the zip codes in the Phoenix area that I wanted to live in. And if you know Phoenix, it's really, really spread out. So I picked the areas of Phoenix I wanted to live in, and then I got those zip codes, and then I went through my list of dentists, and I picked out all the dentists in those zip codes that lived there, deleted all of the specialists, and kind of the same pretty much criteria that Jordan had. And me and my wife, we came up with 817 mailers. And so we sent those out actually the very end of March. We sent those out. And then about a couple weeks later, the responses kind of started coming in. But and then we had a couple options, and then it just kind of went on from there. So
Ike, I got a couple questions for you. With the responses, so you sent out the mailers, 817, and then the responses, they just started. I mean, I feel like it's a little late, right? 2 weeks after you send it out to start getting responses.
Yeah, so I tell you about. So the responses for the practices, I got about 25 to 30 responses, and they were in the form of a text message, an email, a phone call. There was, I want to say, every single one of them was positive. Then the practices started rolling in for about 2 weeks. And I don't know if that's because the mailer sat on their desk and they thought about it for a little bit. The first responses came within probably few days to a week, and then the practices, the opportunities came within about 2 weeks. Actually, I had one a couple weeks ago. Actually, that came in. It was kind of late, but anyway.
That's crazy. So I guess something for our audience to pay attention to if you're going to be doing this technique, to kind of be patient with responses. They could be coming when maybe you're least expecting them.
Yeah, exactly. And I asked Jordan about it, and he talked about his email blast, and I considered doing that, and then I came across a couple of the practices that were kind of ideal for me, and so I started pursuing those rather than doing the email blast. So
Okay, and so you were all your zip codes in the Phoenix area? You weren't looking anywhere other than the Phoenix area?
Correct, exactly.
Okay. And so we talked about how many responses you got, and then you were telling me that you kind of had these opportunities, but it really narrowed down to two. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So like you said earlier, there was essentially, it came down to two practices that we were really interested in, and they were both the $1.5 million offices. They were both fee for service. Both of the owners were at that age where they wanted to retire, and one of them, they were both actually in, like I said, the prime locations that we wanted to live in. And so it kind of came down to what were the numbers that were going to be right for them, what were best for each one of the numbers, and then what were the intangibles, the owner's personality, the exact location, the staff, what they wanted for the office, if they did any specialty procedures. One of these offices, the one that I don't think I'm going to go with, did actually implants and CERAC and ortho, actually a small amount of ortho. And so that was a big attraction, because I thought, man, that would be a good, I can learn. But versus the other office, the one that I'm going to go with, is she didn't do any specialty procedures. And so the opportunity was there for growth, but it was also, I didn't have somebody as kind of a coach in those specialty procedures. So
Yeah, that's kind of a good point where, you have that clinical mentor with one opportunity, which is great if they're going to stay and coach you. But if they're going to leave, then, you have that drop off in production, which is kind of a big red flag. So it's always, really dependent on the seller in that case. So why don't you go ahead and start with the one you're not going to pursue? So tell us about that experience and that relationship. Really what we want to get across in this episode is the relationship with the seller, building it, how it can help you, and also maybe how it might not be the best fit if there's not a great relationship. So why don't you start with that first office?
Yeah, you bet. So this guy, he sent me an email, and he just sent me an email and just said he wanted to talk to me about my future. So I gave him my phone number, and I ended up on a phone call with him and his wife. And he was kind of, I mean, obviously, I was very excited about it and very, interested. And he asked me what my plans were, what I want for the future. And I told him, I said, maybe I'm jumping the gun. I was like, but I really would like to be an owner as soon as possible. If I could do that on the day of graduation, that'd be great. If not, that's fine. And his response was, well, you're not ready to be an owner yet. And he said, you're not ready to be an owner. You don't know that you're not ready to be an owner. He's like, and so, but I can teach you. I can mentor you. And he was like, I'm looking for somebody that I can mentor for a couple years, and then they can then take over my practice. And I asked him if he was interested in, or if he was willing to do the reverse associateship during that time period. And he was not. He didn't give me a direct no, but it wasn't something he was super interested in. And he was kind of a little bit, standoffish at first, and he said, how about we meet for dinner? So he took him and his wife, and then me and my wife met for dinner. And it actually turned out to be a pretty good dinner. He paid for dinner, and we sat there and we talked. And in the beginning, it was kind of like it was a little bit of an interrogation, but towards the end of dinner, it was actually pretty nice. It was pretty easy going. We actually had a pretty good time. And so we left on good terms. And he said, well, why don't you come down and see the office? So a couple weeks after that, me and my wife went down, and by the way, my wife is a hygienist. So in my mailer, I put in there that she was a hygienist, but I didn't. She has a job right now, and as of right now, she's not planning on working for me. But we just, it was possibly in the future. So we went together on a lot of this stuff. But anyway, so we went down and saw his practice, and he was very nice. And his staff did not know anything about his wanting to sell or this and that. So we went down there, looked at his office. It was nice. It was a little bit messy, but it was nice. He was very nice. Showed us around, and we were talking about treatments and talking about how to go about things and this and that. Like I said, he's a fee-for-service practice, and he said that he didn't cut 3 surface fillings. He didn't do 3 surface fillings. He would just put a crown on it. And I asked him why, and he said, well, I only want to go in there once. I only want to do that treatment once, and so I just don't do it. And and if insurance is not involved, I guess that's an option. So anyway, and he had a specific place he did his CE at, and he was very big on that. And he just really really thought highly of that. And he was very kind of negative, I guess, about the other places. And it was just I kind of felt like his way of treating and his way of diagnosing was the only option, and I kind of wanted a little bit more autonomy in that relationship. I wanted to be able to treat patients how I saw fit, not in an unethical manner, but just the way that I want to treat them. And I just kind of got the sense that he was a little bit stern with that. He kind of wanted things done his way, which is totally fine. He's the owner, but I just thought, man, maybe okay, all right, maybe I'd like a little more, freedom in that. But that was kind of where he was at, and we left on good terms, and we left, and we walked out, and then we walked out the door and went home, and like I said, he knows I don't graduate till May, so that's kind of where that's at. So.
As a dental student who is planning on buying a practice, I have contacted just about every bank you can think of trying to get a loan. Every bank I've talked to has told me the same thing. They don't loan to a dentist without a year's experience. Some even want 2 years. I was told repeatedly my only option was to do an SBA loan, which after all the fees amounts to about 7% over 8 years. I was still planning on proceeding since I felt like the benefits of practice ownership outweighed the added cost of an SBA loan. Then, in the process of doing the interviews for this podcast, I met David Alvey. Since the moment I met him, I was blown away. I was so impressed with his knowledge of the industry and how his bank gets it when it comes to financing new grads. They understand the industry well enough to work with new grads and dentists with less experience. They look more at the practice that you are financing than the individual getting the loan itself. Since deciding to go with him to do my loan, I have gone from feeling like I had a coin flip's chance of getting a conventional loan to being confident that my deal will get done coming right out of school with great terms. After doing my interview with David, I knew Atlantic Commercial Credit was the perfect sponsor for this podcast. At Shared Practices, we strive to pave the way to practice ownership, and financing is a big part of that. Richard and I are thrilled to be able to endorse them as a financing solution for individuals who have been told they cannot obtain a loan by other banks. If you are like me and had any doubts about your ability to get a loan, contact me at georgehariri@gmail.com. I'll leave my email in the show notes. I'll put you in contact with David Alvey, who has agreed to do a consultation with anyone I send his way. He understands what we teach on the podcast and is excited to help our listeners get financed. If you are like me and desire to get into practice ownership early in your career, don't let financing be a reason why that doesn't happen for you. Yeah, one small note. I think it's funny that both your wife and Jordan's wife are hygienists. I don't know. that anything's in common with that, but I just wanted to make note of that. And the funny thing is that I want our listeners to know is I've heard about the financials of both of these practices, and this one probably had the better financial opportunity. And if you're just looking straight at the P&L, but again, you don't want somebody dictating your CE. You don't want somebody, just kind of like you told me, having them under your thumb,
Exactly.
So why don't you go ahead and tell us about the second practice, the one that you're really considering?
Yeah. So this is one. Yeah. So super excited about this. So she contacted me again via email, and I called her, and she offered to ask me to call her. So I called her on my way home from school, and the restart of the relationship was different. And she wanted to know about me. Actually, was her when she called me, and she wanted to know if I was an older dental student, and that's why I was pursuing aggressively to be an owner. She wanted to know a little bit about my background, this and that. And so I just talked with her for about 30 minutes on the phone and just kind of told her, what I did. And, I did construction before I went to dental school, and I ran an electrical crew, but that was the only leadership opportunity I had. But anyway, so she was like, okay, awesome. She's like, well, if you and your wife are interested to come down and see my practice, you're more than welcome. So me and my wife went down after hours and met with her. And she met us at the front door. She was expecting us. She was very, very gracious and very nice. Showed us around the practice. The office was very nice, and it was, I don't want to say maybe simple is the right term, but it wasn't over the top. It was just a very impressive, clean, professional looking office. She showed us around the office, answered any questions, and then we sat there in the living room, in the waiting room, in the couches, and we just kind of talked about each other. I remember having the impression, I really wanted to know the numbers on the practice and if it was worth my time to pursue, but I kind of had to hold that urge in check, because I realized that probably was a little bit unprofessional to start pressing her for her staff overhead on the first visit. So I just kind of held myself in check. But and then towards the end of the visit, we talked for probably about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and she was towards the end of the visit, she really opened up, and she was very, and I remember her distinctly telling me, "Ask me anything you want. Ask me anything you want." And she was like asking me about numbers, anything, and she was direct about that. Ask me anything you want. So we talked a little bit about numbers and things. And she told me that she really liked our mailer, my mailer that I'd sent out. I think she used the term adorable, actually, was the term. But we kind of talked about that, and we kind of left it there. And I asked if I'd come in and shadow. So on my break in June, I went in and shadowed her, and I met her. Her staff knew at that point she was looking towards retirement, but they didn't know exactly the timeline for it. So I met her and the staff for the morning huddle. And she stood up and she welcomed me, and she said, "Hey, Dr. Ike, how are you doing?" And I wasn't, I didn't need to be called that or anything, but it made me feel like I was more of a peer to her than I was a dental student. And I think conversely, the staff were very, treated me as such too, and we sat there for the morning huddle, and she asked me questions about what I thought about certain things. And I was engaged in the morning huddle, and then we kind of went about the day, and it was fun to watch her. And she introduced me to a lot of patients at that visit too. And she just was very nice, and she answered any questions I had, and we just kind of got to know each other more. Then she took me to lunch with the staff, and I got to know some more of the staff, more about them, and then we were driving back. It was kind of interesting. I don't know why she asked this, but I remember I drive a little Honda Civic that I saved my money and I paid for before college or before dental school. And she says, "That's your car?" And I said, "Yeah." And she's like, "Is it paid for?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." And she just kind of nodded her head. And I don't know. I don't know if that was one of her part of her litmus tests. I don't know. But anyway, and so we just kept contact. And then a couple weeks ago, I had questions about her lease, and I went down to the office to talk with her. And also during that week, I had talked to David Albee, actually, after I listened to your podcast, and you had kind of interested me in David Albee. And his concern was, when I talked to him, was he said, "This is a great practice from what you tell me." He said, "My only concern is when she's getting this evaluated or appraised, there's a chance she might have gone to a broker unknowingly. And the broker is going to want to sell this office right away because he recognizes that this is it's a very good opportunity. And he'll tell her, 'I have a cash buyer tomorrow.' Even if he doesn't, he'll tell her, 'I have a cash buyer.'" And so he said, you need to go down there and ask her about this and see where you're at. And he said, "I'm more than happy if you do an introduction to tell her that there's a good opportunity for you to get financing as a new grad." Really nice and really, really super nice. So I went down that evening. I was going to meet with her anyway, and we chit-chatted about that. And I asked her about that, and she's like, "Yeah," and she's like, "That's totally fine." And she hadn't, as it turned out, she hadn't gone to a broker yet. But I told her, I was like, "I'm trying to get financing lined up for when I graduate." And she's like, she's like, "If you don't get financing lined up, that's okay," because she's like, "I feel like we're a good fit for each other, and I'm willing to hold off on that and wait until you can get financing if you can at graduation." And I was kind of blown back by that. I was not only very happy about it, but I was just surprised, very, very happy about it. And anyway, and so she just, she kind of said, that's where we're at. And I asked her, I'm like, "If you're okay about me and I'm okay without you, then I want to kind of move forward with this, and I'll give you kind of a verbal commitment." And she was good with that. And she informed her front office that's a plan on me taking over the office. We didn't know exactly the timeline for it, but to plan on that. And she told me that one of the cautions that she got was that people had cautioned her that she needed to have someone take over the office that was a female. And she said that she didn't think that was right. She felt like personality was the biggest thing, because she had spent such a long time. She started practicing in the late 80s, and she'd been at this specific location for a long time, close to 20 years. And she said, these patients are important to me. It's important to me that these patients are taken care of. And she said personality was a big thing for me, and that was a big parameter for her. And she felt like we would be a good match. And I think it turned out to be a great thing, because not only initially I actually was kind of looking for a clean split. I was kind of looking for the owner to walk out on Friday and me to walk in on Monday. And as I learned more about, a lot of practice, the acquisitions and things, I realized that in this specific office, it probably wasn't the best idea because her office value was her patients and the goodwill that they brought to that office, and that I would have a much higher, retention rate with her there and her being present than if she just walked out and I just walked in. And then it kind of came down to, well, can we work together? And I'm excited about it. And I actually, at this point, I actually think it's actually a lot better, even just for me, that she stays on. I'm actually excited about that. Excited about that opportunity for her to be there. And I guess I kind of undervalued a little bit how important the practice was to her and how important it was for her to have someone that she trusted and was going to take care of her office and her practice. I didn't, I guess I didn't realize how important these practices are to some of these owners. So
I think you hit on so many great points there. I kept you going because you were really rolling, and I wanted to kind of circle back to a few things that I think maybe our listeners need to hear again because of how important they are. Okay. First of all, this practice is in Scottsdale. For people who don't know, you hear Scottsdale and that's like the most saturated place on earth. Mm-hmm. But we'll get into that in a second. But the first part of that is when we did the valuation for the practice, Ike and I did it kind of together, and the practice valuation kind of matches all of the parameters that we guide our listeners to follow. It's a well-priced practice. It's profitable enough. It's also big enough. And then, like Ike said, for a new grad, it can support 2 doctors, and it's just a really ideal practice. And for how much of a seller's market Scottsdale is, that practice would fly off the shelf if it was ever listed with a broker. And so Ike's off-market strategy allowed him to really have access to this opportunity like I feel that my strategy did and Jordan's strategy did. It allowed us to have access to these opportunities that we would have absolutely never had otherwise as dental students. I think that's kind of the big thing there. If you're a seasoned associate or somebody out there, I think you could have access to a practice like this if it's listed and you are in contact with the right people. But, as a dental student, there's no chance that you're getting a practice like that if you don't do it this way.
Absolutely.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about is that how many ops is this practice?
It's 4 ops. It's plumb for 5, but she only outfitted 4. She just uses 4.
And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys were talking about her equipping that last op at her expense, correct?
Yes, we work. So she has basically, she uses that as an office, but she has another office that she doesn't really use. And so she was more than happy to, she said, yeah, she's like, she talked about the specialty procedures. She didn't do any of the specialty procedures, ortho, endo, implants, things like that. And so it kind of became, well, if you want to invest in those procedures, maybe we can outfit that op for those procedures. And that was a discussion that we had for sure. And she was good with.
Yeah, that's huge. From hearing her, and I've never met her obviously, but from hearing you talk about her, it seems very apparent that she's very invested in you. And I think that's the kind of point that I want to make to our listeners is how important it is to have somebody invested in you.
And I just remember this. I want to throw this in. I actually, at the school, there was an orthodontist and an oral surgeon that I had. They were in that same zip code. They were still on the mailing list of that same zip code. And so I had sent them mailers in those because they used to practice in those areas. And I sent them mailers just because I wanted them to have, to see my mailer and if they knew anybody. Well, as it turns out, they both know this owner, and they both said the same thing, that she was not only a great dentist, but that she was well respected in the area, and that she was a very upfront and honest dentist from what they knew. And that was my impression of her too. So I got it was nice that I feel very fortunate that just kind of worked out that way, but they were both very, very complimentary of her. So
yeah. And, I can say the same. There's a specialist at our school that my doc referred to also. Yeah, I think that just is another verification. The other thing I want to talk about before we go into building this relationship, I wanted to talk about, so I have a seller financing component to my deal, and I feel it was that relationship that allowed me to get it. You do not have a seller financing component, is that correct?
That's correct. So it was not something she was interested in.
So your relationship with her, instead of getting you a seller financing deal like mine did, it got you her patience for your financing. So it's just kind of a small nuance there, but I think it's important to note that either way, the relationship was beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now I want you to talk about, from your perspective, meeting these sellers and talking to them. What are their priorities that you found as a selling dentist?
So you mean just like of the five that I got, the five opportunities?
Yeah, and just from your experience, having talked to these people and entertaining them, if you could give advice to somebody who's looking to build that same advantageous relationship with a seller, what are the things that a seller is looking for that could help a buyer? If they know their priorities, then they can maybe play to that a little bit and talk about those things a little bit more, like, maybe their patients, their staff, what kind of things are important to the seller?
For sure. So sounds kind of corny, but they used to say when you go on a date with a new girl, they say, just be yourself. Well, it kind of goes back to that. And I think that the correlation between the two is that if you're just yourself and you're very honest about what your priorities are, that owner is going to kind of screen you to see if you're a good fit too. And so if you are disingenuous about what you want, or you're kind of trying to just get in the door, I don't think that's going to be I think that's kind of a short game method. I think that you have to just be honest about what you want, and if you want an acquisition, or if you're looking for an associateship or what. And I think that kind of yields the best relationships, because you'll find that owner that you relate with and that you have that relationship with. And I think that they're kind of screening you just like you're screening them, and they put that trust in you, that they let you into their office, and they open their doors to their information, and they want to know that they're not getting fooled, or you're not just going to take the practice in a place that they want to go. And I think that if it's not going to work out, you want to know that early on. And I think that why that transparency is probably such a good thing to have. And I think it's just better for both parties. And I think that, kind of like I said, in the beginning, I wanted to know numbers right away, but I think that the owner deserves that time to get to know you and to get to know what you want, and that kind of thing, and to just kind of let them take the business aspect of it where they want. Because I kind of found out was most of them wanted just to get to know me. They kind of wanted to know me and where I was from, and they kind of wanted to feel good about me first before they were willing to open their proverbial doors to their privacy of their finances. So
one of the fastest ways to increase case acceptance in your office is through digital photography. However, it doesn't matter if you buy a fancy DSLR if you don't actually use your camera. There's a course on speareducation.com called 6 Images That Will Improve Case Acceptance, given by Dr. Steve Ratcliffe.
These are the 6 images that we're talking about. A natural smile, an image with the lips retracted and the teeth slightly apart, occlusal shots of both the maxillary and mandibular arches, and buccal images with the teeth slightly apart. The reason we choose these 6 images is that in 6 simple pictures, you can show your patients every surface of every tooth in the mouth, their relationship to one another, and also look at the health of the gum tissue and surrounding structures. The equipment is really very basic, and one of the things...
The great part about this course is that not only does Dr. Ratcliffe go through what the photos are, the equipment you need, how to take them, but you can also have your staff watch this video and then take these for you. Now, maybe you're not going to trust every single team member to take all these photos, but having 1 or 2 key individuals that can take these photos for you can alleviate that feeling of, I do not want to take another set of photos right now. To get access to this course on digital photography and hundreds of others, go to speareducation.com and request a guest pass. If you mention the Shared Practices podcast, that'll actually get you a 30-day trial, and then you can use the promo code LOW200, LOW200, for $200 off your annual membership.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. By no means are we saying be disingenuous with anybody and, say whatever you have to say to get a deal done. We're talking about, what's important to sellers and what's important to buyers, and try to find that connection between the seller and the buyer. And I think a lot of times, if you're the right buyer, which I think this podcast breeds the right buyers, which is why I'm so passionate about the things I'm doing on the side of this podcast with, finding practices for people and all that. I think we are a good set of buyers, and, if we just know how to interact with sellers. I'm going to talk a little bit about my case because I feel like my episode didn't cover this as much. I think Jordan and I focused so much about finding the practice that we didn't really get to talk about this. And that's really why I wanted to have you on, is because when I was going into my opportunity, I assured them that I'm interested in the long term, having the right practice, the right seller, the right relationship. And, I'm not going to get caught down in minutia, like you guys are not getting caught up in purchase price. You're not getting caught up in closing dates or in, terms of the LOI. That stuff, kind of like Hunter Smith talks about on the podcast, where it's just, that really hurts the goodwill of the relationship, and that relationship can be very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I wanted to talk about was the kind of flexibility that you may have to have as a buyer, where you may enter something like, I wanted to buy my real estate really bad, but, I kind of learned that was maybe a button that I shouldn't push with the seller because they wanted that real estate for a little bit. And I was flexible because I appreciated the opportunity and I thought the practice was worth it. So I didn't do it. Did you have anything like that where you kind of came in thinking I had to be one way and then you're like, oh, I guess you kind of did because you said the seller staying on wasn't really something you wanted?
That is exactly the first thing that came to mind, because I was kind of like, I could be a good associate or I could be a good owner, but I couldn't be both. And I kind of I wanted to be an owner right away. And I even told her that, and as things progressed, and I'd heard a lot of bad stories about partnerships that went south, and it ruined good deals. And my brother, actually, I hope it doesn't mind me sharing this, but my brother, had one that kind of, that it just didn't work out at first. And it was just, and so I kind of was not really looking for a partnership. I was more of looking for kind of a clean split, excuse me. And I was willing to just take that learning curve and go with it, because I could make the changes that I wanted to make and I could make them right away. And then I realized there was a lot of value in having that owner stay on if you got along. I think was, you referred me to the Ask Hunter thread on Dentaltown, and he talked about his owner and how important and crucial that owner ended up being for him and helping his learning curve early on. And I kind of thought the same thing later on, was that maybe that was how it was going to be for me. And that I even told the owner, I said, if you're obviously doing something right, you have something good. It's been being successful for a long time here, and I don't want to change that. Whether I'm the owner or whether I'm not, it's not important to me that I'm immediately known as the owner and I have to have that power. And I told her that, and I think she appreciated that. I think she appreciated the fact that I recognized to her what she had done, and I wasn't going to force it, if it wasn't there. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that just kind of goes back to maybe being flexible with your vision allows you to have these fantastic opportunities. I did want to circle back to the demographics because I promised I would, and it would be a shame if I didn't because of, kind of what my episode was all about. So you kind of had the best of both worlds, where you talked to Jordan about finding this practice, and you had the mass mailing to get you all these opportunities, and then you kind of talked to me about running the demographics on them.
I did. I really lucked out, actually.
So let me tell you guys a little bit about the demographics. So, as I previously stated, Scottsdale's, kind of known to be, one of the most saturated places. But this particular practice is located in a place that a freeway is in the vicinity. And if the freeway kind of serves as a barrier where maybe a more saturated side's on the other side of the freeway. So when we did the, 1, 3, and 5 mile radii around the practice, it kind of came around, I think, a little bit higher than 2,000 to 1, but not too much higher, which, but the income is really high. It was like, what, 110?
I think it was actually a little closer to 120 at the 2 mile radius. I think at the 1 mile, I think it was 110.
Yeah. So, 2 miles most important, and it came out about 110. And so, I mean, those are demographics that I think he would be very happy with, especially considering the size of the practice. The location's very visible. So I just want to make that point again that, Ike buying a practice in Scottsdale doesn't mean terrible demographics. It actually means, good demographics, not fantastic, but good, and great visibility. So, I mean, that's a winning combination with all the other things he said in an area that he wants to live. I would definitely chalk that up to be a fantastic opportunity. And
I think you made the point to me too, because I kind of came and asked you about, this idea behind you can't get a practice in these areas? And I think you kind of told me there was pockets of good and there's pockets of bad in the Phoenix area. And maybe that's like throughout all of the other saturated, quote unquote, saturated areas in the United States, that there's pockets of good and pockets of bad. And the demographic analysis enables you to find those pockets of good.
Exactly.
So.
And so yeah. for our listeners, you kind of have, an interesting perspective. I kind of talked about it with Jordan and me. So if you were to go through it again, would you recommend somebody starts with the mailing or starts with my maybe more demographic intensive process of targeting, very select few offices and then calling them and pursuing them?
I think that definitely that's a good question. I think it definitely depends on the size that you're looking at. If you're looking at a micro scale, I think that I really liked your idea because you didn't waste time, putting your energy in direction that it wasn't going to work. But if on kind of a macro scale, it's really hard to do that demographic analysis for half of a state, for instance, but if you're going to do that, then maybe the mailers might, it's almost like maybe finding that balance in between the two, because both of them were so helpful. Like I said, I wouldn't be this, happy about the opportunity. I don't think if I had both of them. And so I think it kind of comes down to, do you have to stay in your hometown? And maybe I would probably take your approach first. But if you're like, hey, I'm willing to go across this state and this state or this half of the state, that broader search then. And then when you find those opportunities, then you can do the demographic analysis on those opportunities. So
I really, really like that answer. If anybody didn't listen to that, go back and listen to it again. I was actually in my mind, Jordan and I were kind of off camera or off air, struggling a little bit with, who had the better tactic. We both found great offices, great opportunities, but I'll go back to it. I think Ike said it very wisely that, if you're looking at a small area, then maybe my technique of calling offices that are very targeted might get you, because I don't think, I know for a fact that my sellers would not have responded to a mailer because they didn't respond to multiple phone calls. It took me a long time to break that door. I just knew exactly which door I wanted, and so I kept going for it. Versus Ike, she called on the mailer, maybe a lower barrier of entry for her. She wasn't as, standoffish to the idea, but again, you were able to survey a very large area. I think that's very valuable.
Yeah, I think there's a balance between those two, but they're both fantastic.
All right, well, I think we got a great interview from Ike. I'm happy that I had one of my classmates on. Most of my classmates don't really know that I do this, and it's not something I really advertise. But, he happened to listen to the podcast and contact me, and I think it worked out really nicely where we got to work together and, help him find this great opportunity. Ike has been nice enough to share his version of the rack card that Jordan shared last week. And so if you want to get that, that's on our resource page. And then, Ike's on our Facebook group. So if you want to interact with him, he's definitely going to be there answering questions if any come up at all.
You bet.
Do you have anything you want to add before we go, Mike?
I don't think so. I think I pretty much got everything. So yeah, no, thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Awesome. I think this is a very valuable episode for our listeners who are maybe younger and have that time to build that relationship and get into ownership a little early with these fantastic opportunities. I really appreciate having you on, Ike.
Thanks, George. Have a good one.
Okay, cool. That was really fun to have a listener of our show who'd met you and connected with you because of the show, and now he's on the show. So that I don't know. There's something about that that's just a whole lot of fun. And the thing that he brought together, Ike brought together this idea of when you should do an off-market approach. So how would you summarize that? Why would you want to do these off-market approaching as of reaching out directly either through phone calls, email, or mail marketing?
Well, I think it's twofold. I think the first and most obvious is if you have a lot of time before you're going to be an owner, whether that's a military commitment or, like a dental student or something like that, where you can have a year or 6 months to build that relationship and then have it be to your advantage. And then the other one is if you've really exhausted all opportunities with brokers and you just can't find something. The easiest way is if you find a great practice with a broker. And the point that I was trying to make in this episode is that I would have never had that practice with a broker because he would have never been shown it because he was a dental student.
Well, and he's a dental student looking at Scottsdale. It's the deals would go so fast and would be so hard to get that it just wouldn't happen. It wouldn't come to him.
Exactly. And he was able to get that deal because he went off market. So I think it's not for everybody. It's a lot more work, but then there's a bigger reward for the right person.
And I would add to that I don't think that by default you're going to get a better deal or a better practice necessarily. I think you can find a good practice through a broker. You can find a good practice off market, but there are definitely, it's just a whole segment of the market that's not publicly visible or easily accessible. And so there's always gaps and opportunities where you have to do a whole lot of work to get to something that other people aren't willing to do.
Yeah, I don't think I could have said that better myself. Absolutely.
So you had talked to me about this idea of what you thought sellers were going to be worried about when you were reaching out to sellers. So what did you think sellers were going to be worried about when you first started like reaching out to people and analyzing these practices?
It's funny. I think this whole misconception that I had is what really triggered this whole episode, because I really wanted people to figure out what exactly sellers care about, because I was so wrong. I thought I wrote down a list of 3. I thought the first thing they'd be most interested in is the purchase price.
Okay.
I thought the second thing would be like the buyer's clinical worthiness or qualifications or how good clinically they are, because they'd be working on their patients. And so when I was going through my process, I actually went to my school, printed out my procedure reports, printed out my class average, and went to my seller showing them like, look at how much more I am than my class. And they didn't really care.
That makes me so happy. I don't know why that's like hilarious to me, but I mean, like legitimately, what are you going to do? Like bring a bunch of x-rays and show them like, look at my crown margins. These are phenomenal crown margins.
It sounds foolish, but I genuinely thought that. And then the other thing, I thought that they cared about the specific terms, like the minutia that we talk about on this podcast, and they really don't.
Yeah, no. And all of the analyzing that we do, I mean, the types of episodes that we've had and the types of people we've had on the podcast, like we care about these details and the terms and the money. And so we assume that other people care and think about those same things at the same level, and that's not necessarily true at all. So what did you actually find that people care about when they're looking at potential people to buy their practice?
I think there was kind of 2 things that really stood out to me, was their patients and their staff. You know, I think they have guilt for leaving both behind in their transition. They feel like both their staff and their patients allowed them to build their whole career's income and allowed them to retire and all these things. And then they don't want to feel like they're leaving them high and dry, where the staff still has to work there and they can't retire also. And then the patients, you know, just gave that doctor all of their business for how many years, and now they're just handing them off. So they really want to make sure that the buyer, whoever that is, respects their patients and their staff. I think that's the biggest thing that I found out in the process.
And I wouldn't say that, you know, it's a requirement to care about your patients and your staff, but I think if you want to be really, really successful, I think it definitely is. So, and I say that kind of jokingly because some people don't care as much. And that would be a practice that I personally wouldn't want to buy. I want to buy a practice that the staff is invested and that the patients love the staff and the patients love the doc. And so, of course, you're going to have a doc that cares back about them as much as you would want to coming into the practice. So I don't know why, but this totally makes sense. But I also wouldn't assume that up front. Okay, so what else do you feel was a priority to them that you didn't expect?
I think the last 2 things would be that their reputation with the patient base. I think making sure that they have trust in you to never throw them under the bus in times where it could be, you know, dentistry is humbling. I think we all know that. And to know that you're going to do what's in the best interest of preserving that patient's image of the previous doctor was, to my sellers, incredibly important, something that they asked me about multiple times. And also the purchase price, I think, is something that comes in there somehow, but I just don't think it's at the top. But I also think it's important. They want to feel like they're getting a number that's worth their practice, because their practice is kind of more to them than it is to us. And so they don't want to feel like they are being shorted. And that's why Hunter talks so much about not negotiating on price.
It's kind of funny because right now in the military, I'm in a group practice setting where everyone sees everyone's work, and you can't really like hide necessarily your if someone wasn't doing quality work. But if someone's alone in a private practice, like for years and years and years, you don't have another doc looking at your crowns, your fillings, you know, the way you've done things for a period of time. You're kind of getting naked in front of someone, and you can be very self-conscious about, here is how I've done things in my practice. Here's how I've clinically done dentistry. Here's my relationships and my systems. And they want to maintain that reputation and respect. So that's something that I think we don't consider enough.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the seller too. You know, like some older sellers are really involved in study groups and stuff like that. And they might be more open to that. But my sellers were very shy. They didn't do a whole lot of CE. Their clinical dentistry was very hidden. And so, yeah, I think it's something that I didn't see coming, but it definitely surprised me.
And from this interview, from this interview and the last interview, just this idea that you have to go out and meet these people. If you're doing these off-market deals, you're going to have to really feel out the relationship, feel out the practice. And that's why it's so hard to do this and time and labor intensive, because you can't just do that via a broker. Like, you are kind of being the broker in that you are building the relationship, and the relationship is what's going to get the deal done.
And the relationship was, to both Ike and myself, a huge asset to getting the deal done. And the one point that I really want to make is Ike really did a good job of comparing and contrasting our two methods, Jordan and I, that we talked about previously on the podcast, where if you're looking at like a macro scale, you know, Jordan's method is very effective. The smaller the scale, the more it may lean towards my method. And so I think he had a very interesting perspective there that I think is worth repeating.
Well, and so that idea that you don't have to do what George did unless you want to be in a very specific competitive area. And then you might have to put on your George pants and do a whole ton of analysis. But otherwise, the shotgun approach and the kind of the large scale analysis might work out in your favor. So yeah, I thought that was a great balance of the two.
Absolutely. I think this turned out to be a great episode.
Well, cool. Well, did he say that we were going to share I can't remember if we're going to share the PDF of what his mailer looked like, or if we're just going to do the one.
No, he's also agreed to upload his, so you'll see Jordan's iteration in Ike and his family. Awesome.
Okay, cool. So we'll have that online on the resources page. Join us on Facebook if you haven't already, the Shared Practices group. And then also, if you get a chance, please leave us a review on iTunes, and we will talk with you guys next week.